Okay, continuing on with our discussion of the Constitution, let's look at the Philadelphia Convention. As previously mentioned, one of the things that led up to the Philadelphia Convention or the Constitutional Convention was Shays' Rebellion. Again, as previously stated, Shays' Rebellion was kind of the icing on the cake that helped illustrate the fact that the articles really weren't functioning in a manner that they needed to. Another thing that led up to the Philadelphia Convention was the Annapolis Convention. The Annapolis Convention was a collection of a few states that got together to talk about the lack of commercial activity or the impediments to commercial activity in the states at the time. And what they ended up doing was sending a letter to the Articles Congress and asking them to form call a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments. And then the national government under the Articles responded, and that takes us to the convention in Philadelphia. Walking in the door were the folks from Virginia, and they had what was called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan was advocated primarily by large states. There are many details to the Virginia Plan and, of course, to the corresponding plan, the New Jersey Plan, but the key problem or the key feature of the Virginia Plan that will cause problems is going to be how the representation in the national legislature is going to be allocated. The Virginia Plan was going to call for a national legislature to be composed of two houses, and the two houses, the representation in the two houses would be based upon how large your state was in terms of population, or based upon how much money your state generated in taxation for the national government. So those states that might have been smaller population-wise, but had a lot of economic activity, would have still received more representation. The counter to this proposal is going to be the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan could be thought of as the small state plan, and what it's going to do is it's going to provide for a single house national legislature that is going to be where states will be represented equally. Okay, and again, I want to emphasize that the Virginia Plan and New Jersey Plan had more to them than just this notion of representation, but that was the main sticking point. The rest of the differences between the plans were relatively easy to work out. However, who was going to get representation in the national legislature, in essence, who was going to have the power, big states, small states, that was the major sticking point. This was so problematic that it was put, so to speak, on the back burner, and they began working through other problems with what would become the Constitution. Finally, toward the end of the convention, the Great Compromise was proposed. The Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, has at its heart the idea that one house of the national legislature would be based upon equality, states being represented equally, and the other house of the national legislature, you would have states being represented based upon population, and that's the form that the Constitution took. Other compromises of note include the Electoral College. The Electoral College was designed as a mechanism to select the president. In reality, it wasn't going to select the president for reasons that I'll explain in just a moment. It was a compromise between big states and small states. Let me explain how the Electoral College operates, and then I'll explain how it ends up being a compromise between big states and small states. The President of the United States will be, in theory, selected by the Electoral College. To win the Electoral College, a candidate must receive a majority of votes cast by the electors. Each state will receive a number of electors equal to senators plus representatives. So obviously big states have an advantage there. However, remember, there are no political parties at the time, so it's very easy to see how you might have 2, 3, 4, 5 realistic candidates for the presidency. Just imagine sitting in the convention and looking around the room. Obviously, George Washington could be a contender. He was going to win no matter what. But other people in the room, Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, while he wasn't in the room, was surely thought about. John Adams and others they were in the room, they were looking around, and they could all be viable candidates. Well, if you're required to have a majority, what is the probability that someone will receive a majority when you have 5 or 6 candidates? The probability is almost non-existent. So the Constitution provides that in the event the Electoral College does not return a majority for a candidate, the election will be determined by the House of Representatives. However, when picking the president, each state will get one vote. Well, there are more small states than there are large states. So large states have an advantage in the Electoral College when it comes to selecting the initial three that will advance to the House. However, since no one is going to receive a majority, the top three candidates, in essence selected by the large states, will go to the House of Representatives, and then the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote, and remember, small states have more votes, the small states, in effect, then will pick the ultimate winner. So the Electoral College is, in effect, a compromise between big states and large states. It is also a compromise between the North and the South, because the South will be receiving more votes in the Electoral College than it typically would have because of the 3/5 compromise. Another compromise is the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise proposed or stipulates that the slaves in the southern states will be counted as 3/5 of a person for both the purposes of taxation and the purposes of representation. So while southern states will not have that many voters, they will get more representation in the Congress than what they would otherwise, and they will have a disproportionately larger impact in the Electoral College than they would have otherwise. Another compromise is the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. The Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise provides that the national government will have the ability to regulate interstate commerce, which is one of the reasons why the articles were being criticized. Okay, so the national government will receive the ability to regulate interstate commerce. However, there will be no taxes on exports, and the slave trade cannot be prohibited for a time period. The importation of slaves cannot be prohibited for a time period of 20 years. So again, a compromise between the North and the South. There are a host of other compromises that the Constitution rests upon, but the ones that I previously stated are the principal compromises. What was left out of the Constitution primarily was the determination as to who gets the right to vote, or suffrage. The Constitution does not explicitly dictate who can and cannot vote. There is some language in the Constitution that says that to be able to vote for the U.S. House of Representatives, the qualifications must be the same as whatever the qualifications are for a state's lowest house of its state legislature. Beyond that, voter qualifications are entirely left up to each state. Each state decides who can and cannot vote based upon whatever criteria it wishes. Over a period of time, beginning with the time period of Jacksonian democracy up to the 1960s, various barriers to participation, both formal and informal, will be removed. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about elections and civil rights. Features of the Constitution. The first feature is the idea of checks and balances. Checks and balances is a system by which one branch of government or one institution of government can check or counteract another branch or another institution. The purpose behind checks and balances was to prevent tyranny. The idea was it is better to have no decision than to have a bad decision. And while this might have been good for a country that was geographically isolated, whose nearest enemy was 3,000 miles away, and was largely agrarian, that may not be the best way to do things now. Many individuals would argue that checks and balances creates a system of gridlock, or contributes to a system of gridlock that we find in U.S. politics today. An example of checks and balances would be where Congress passes a piece of legislation. The legislation is presented to the president, and if the president doesn't approve of it, he can veto it. If the Congress can muster 2/3 majority in both houses, the veto can be overridden. However, in effect, a veto is almost always permanent. Vetoes can only be overridden typically around 4% of the time. So a veto is an incredibly effective tool that the president has. Another feature of the Constitution is the idea of separation of powers. Separation of powers provides that lawmaking, law executing, and law interpreting functions will be vested in separate and distinct institutions. This creates what is called presidential government. okay, which is the opposite or invariance of parliamentary government. Another feature of the Constitution is federalism. Federalism provides for a division of power between the national government and the states. The national government will be allocated some functions. These will be called delegated powers, and the states will have other governmental functions, and these will be called reserve powers. For clarity's sake, I would advise you to only refer to federalism using the term division of power, while grammatically separation of power would be correct as well. In U.S. politics, separation of power always refers to the three separate branches of government. So whenever we talk about federalism, we try to use the term division of power. Republican form of government. What is meant by this term is that the government of the United States and of the states must be some sort of representative government. Secularism. The Constitution of the United States is a secular document. There is no mention of any sort of God, deity, or a creator, other than the possible exception if you look at how it is dated. It is dated using the term AD, which translates into the phrase, in the year of our Lord. Beyond that, the Constitution makes no mention of God, deity, or creator, as does the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution of the United States furthermore prohibits the use of any religious test. What is meant by that phrase is that you cannot be required to profess belief in any God, deity, or religious concept. At the time of the Constitution, many state constitutions required that to be a state legislator or to be a governor, you had to swear that you believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, or he was God incarnate, or swear that you believed in the concept of the Trinity. All of those tests are prohibited by the Constitution of the United States. No person can be required to profess belief in anything to be an officer of the United States. The Constitution of the United States also provides for a single executive. Executive power is vested in a president of the United States. This is very different than what you will find in most state governments both today and at the time of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. For example, many states provide that will provide for the election of a state treasurer, a state attorney general, and various other state officers. And the state constitution will vest those individuals with specific powers that the governor cannot control. The governor cannot order an elected state attorney general to do too terribly much. That person, because they are elected and vested by their state constitution with executive power, is largely independent of the governor. Whereas at the national level in the United States, the president is the single executive, and all other executives derive their authority and their power from this individual. The Constitution of the United States, as it was originally designed, provided for limited popular participation, which means that the individual citizen was greatly limited into how they could participate. As the Constitution was originally written, the only elected position that people directly voted for was U.S. representative. U.S. senators at the time of the original Constitution were to be selected by state legislatures. This will be changed during the progressive period of American history. The President of the United States would be selected by the Electoral College, with electors being selected in any manner that states chose, and most oftentimes state legislatures desired to pick them. And then finally, federal judges were to be selected by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. As such, popular participation in the new national government was greatly limited.